Hello everybody, and welcome to the two keynotes that will focus on religion, environment, and climate change. It's such a pleasure to see all of you joining. And as we already know, the theme of this conference is religion in an unstable world, challenges, transformations, and future prospects. So if one is to be asked to name variables contributing to instability of the world at this point in time, climate change is likely to come up. It is threatening the planet and subsequently human security, and it's also fueling violent conflicts, as we have seen in different parts of the world. The IPCC report of 2022 warned that the world is set to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius level within the next 2 decades. And only the most drastic cuts in carbon emissions from now would help prevent an environmental disaster. So climate action is thus imperative. The IPCC also stated that humans are the drivers of climate change. This means that addressing climate change, be it through mitigation and adaptation efforts, or managing climate-related violent conflicts, requires more than the techno-scientific approaches, since human behavior is involved. But the question is, to what extent is this happening? To what extent are humans involved in addressing climate change? And what is the role of religion, beliefs, worldviews, and sacred practices in these efforts? So to engage with these and many more questions, we have two distinguished speakers here today, Dr. Lisa Schipper and Mr. Ashish Kotari. I will briefly introduce Lisa in a moment, and Ashish will be introduced just before he speaks. But before I proceed, just a few housekeeping issues. So write down your questions in the chat as we go along. We will post them to the presenters at the end of both presentations in the Q&A session. The talks will be recorded, but not the Q&A. So now I would like to introduce and invite Dr. Lisa Schipper to take the floor. So Dr. Lisa Schipper is an environmental social science research fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. She was coordinating lead author of Chapter 18 of the Working Group 2 contribution to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and that was focusing on climate resilient development pathways. She's particularly interested in socio-cultural dimensions of vulnerability, including gender, culture, and religion, as well as structural issues related to power, justice, and equity. More information about her is also in the book of abstracts. The title of Lisa's talk is Belief in the Politics of Climate Change Discourses, Persuasion, Narratives, and Obstruction. So Lisa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jerome, and thank you for inviting me. Let me just get my screen sharing going. So good, you should be able to see me. Yeah, excellent. So hello, everybody. I'm very honored to have been invited to give this talk today, particularly because I'm not a sociologist, and I'm sort of a closet admirer of everything that has to do with the way that religion and society interact. But it's really not something that I'm expert on explicitly, which you may notice. But I have been involved in a number of initiatives that explore the role of religious belief in influencing the way that people interpret natural hazards, as well as the way that how beliefs influence people's behavior and their attitudes and other dimensions that have an impact on their vulnerability to these hazards. And in much of what I've found, religious belief, which I think the way I understand it is quite broad, which also includes traditional or customary beliefs, can make people both more exposed and sensitive to natural hazards and by extension, climate change. But religious belief can also be a driver of resilience. And recently I've been focusing on trying to understand how belief, again, understood broadly, in fact, even maybe including political beliefs, influences how people interpret warnings and communications about climate change. So, yes. So today, therefore, I want to focus on the notion of urgency and emergency and try to unpack what seems to persuade people toward or away from climate action, including things like voting for politicians who take action, as well as taking individual action, and the way that different narratives connect with other held beliefs, and how some beliefs lead to obstruction of action, including lobbying to deny the reality of climate change. So in 25 minutes, I'm not going to be able to satisfactorily address all of these issues, so I suspect that I will instead introduce a number of things that will inevitably raise questions, and hopefully we can address some of these in the discussion. And I really hope I don't confuse you. But I want to start with this. Oops, no, not this. So Jurm just introduced, I've been involved in the IPCC, and at the end of February, the Working Group 2 published its report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and that's where I was one of the people leading one of the chapters. And this report is part of the 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC, which is a kind of a continuously expanding and contracting institution that's been in place under the UN Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization since 1988. It expands for each cycle. So the 6th one, this is when authors are selected for chapters. And then in our case, we had 270 authors in the Working Group 2. And then, of course, it contracts in between in the sessions when governments then have received the reports and then decide that they want to invite the IPCC to do another report. So what's interesting with this is that there's sort of some overlap with who is there, authors who continue to be involved in the process, although each time you have to be nominated and then, of course, selected as well. But there's a certain IPCC ethos that remains, but also there's an somewhat unwritten rule about the way that you sort of move from one cycle to the next. And just to be clear, this is about assessing the state of scientific knowledge on climate change. It's not about doing any research. We just look at the existing published literature and knowledge. And we always build on, kind of pick up on what the previous report has said and look at the literature that's been published since then. But what's also interesting is that the sort of we sort of grandfather these existing framings of the problem as well, which I think is problematic. But this is the way it's been done. You sort of pick up the same kind of approach, the same kind of presentation of the issues. And that means we still go from impacts to adaptation to then really saying, well, what's vulnerability out of that? And I think that you can argue that they maybe need to be reorganized a bit. And in the Working Group 2 report, the summary for policymakers identified this as the punchline, which is that the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. This is essentially the punchline. This is, and I'm quite proud of this, was in the section that I was part of crafting, and governments, of course, helped with the language in the end. But, then coming out of this, I think I was a little bit surprised because actually, we felt that it was to some extent a small victory to get this paragraph through because it stresses the need for action. And the IPCC is not allowed to be policy prescriptive. It can only be policy relevant. So words like need are not allowed to be in there. But have a look at this video quickly. This is just a 2-minute video, and I hope it works for everybody.
We cannot hear the sound. That's the only thing.
It's just music. Okay. I think you get the point. This is not a message that's new. And the fact that we've actually that this message went through probably isn't that very surprising. But I think what's important to reflect on then is really, why does it seem like this is so important to write and say? And what has changed since 2000 and earlier? And what hasn't changed since those messages first appeared? And this is where I sort of start thinking a little bit more about the way that emergency is framed and what that means. And so, what we're seeing all over the place are these kinds of statements. This is a kind of a rallying cry for a lot of the climate activists. This is something that we see, from Extinction Rebellion to other kinds of climate groups and even governments. So this is from the New Zealand Labour Party. And, it's about declaring this emergency. And we have heard from different countries, certainly around 2019, there was a big push to make a declaration of, climate emergency, and newspapers like The Guardian shifting to talk about the climate crisis and really emphasizing the urgency of the problem. But of course, this isn't, a lot of research is now going into wondering what exactly do these declarations mean. And you can see here, for instance, that this is from June 2019, where Canada declared a climate emergency on Monday, and on Tuesday, it approved a pipeline extension. So clearly there is some inherent huge contradictions there. And I think it's sort of worthwhile then exploring what this actually means for the way that we approach, understand climate change. And we land on some really kind of big questions. First of all, what is an emergency? But then whose emergency? And I think this one is fundamental because it is something that we each interpret differently, and it depends a lot on our worldviews and the cultural baggage that we come with. But then also the way that the emergency is framed can have different kinds of knock-on effects. And ultimately, what we want to know is, do these kinds of declarations lead to more action or more inaction? And I guess in relative to today's talk, the biggest question is how do beliefs, like pre-existing beliefs that people have, influence the way people interpret these statements? So I want to go back to the science quickly. And I think, emergency can mean a lot of different things. Sorry, this should. Apologies. Okay, I've made it anyway. So for a long time, scientists have been really cautious, kind of stepping around this 1.5 limit and saying, we don't really want to suggest that we're going to miss that target, that we're going to go past it. But evidence is piling up to suggest that actually maybe 1.5 staying globally, global average staying below 1.5 is quite impossible. Keep in mind, of course, there are places around the world that have already exceeded 1.5. So 1.5, when we talk about it, is just the global average. So, that already, what this brings out is a kind of difference in attitude between, should we either accept that 1.5, it's too late, and that this basically means that there's nothing we can do. Or should we say, okay, maybe it's too late, and there we have to be more aggressive in adaptation? Or should we say, no, actually, we just need to get on with it. The policy changes and reduce emissions, and we can do it. And so all of these different things, I think, relate to things like fatalism and other kinds of sort of beliefs that maybe we can unpack and see whether people fall into those different kind of understandings of climate change. And I think this is, James Dyke from Exeter, here in this tweet, he's sort of saying, okay, let's just be honest, like we're not going to be able to limit to 1.5. And I think, after that, he essentially broke the ice, and there were a number of academics after that kind of following him. But I think it's interesting to ask, why is it so incredibly difficult for us to say this? And it raises questions that I've managed to hide behind this picture because I did a bad job of putting the slide together, but it raises questions about whether scientists are telling the truth or not. And this implies that you can believe in science or not. And it also raises questions about who these scientists are and who, or, are activists somehow involved, and who actually are we listening to? So when you start seeing these messages, when you start mapping them out, you see that they sort of range from a kind of techno-romanticism or techno-optimism to probably doomism on the other side. And for many people, saying that we will pass 1.5 degrees is associated with doomism. But this has really real examples and very real consequences for the way people understand the climate crisis, and in particular, their agency to respond to it. I think first important to mention that, of course, there's still a huge amount of denialism of climate change. And that's not really what I'm talking about here. This is just an article, letter that was published today in response to a journalist who is denying the science on climate change. And I think, that is a whole kind of set of different problems. So I'm not really talking about denialism, but I just want to raise it, the fact that this is, of course, still a massive issue. What I'm really talking about is kind of the divergence in perspectives of all those people who understand climate change to be a problem and who see that it's really, really something to deal with, but who have then different understandings of how to deal with it. So one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again is the role that the different ways that we kind of act on climate change, and I don't mean action like policy, I mean probably more action like activist action, and speak about climate change, has influence on climate anxiety, and the way that people maybe forces people to, my slide doesn't work, forces people to kind of think a lot about, maybe we shouldn't do anything because maybe it's too late, like I said earlier. So I think, we have scientists who are part of Scientist Rebellion. And on the 9th of April, there was a big sort of event where lots of scientists, which is basically Extinction Rebellion for scientists, glued themselves to banks in Los Angeles and around the place. And it caused a huge stir. They got arrested, and there was sort of just a big thing about it. And there's somebody who is a climate communicator who picked up on this, and she noted from TikTok that there were lots of different videos of people saying, as a result of this big protest, they were feeling more anxious. And you can see the kinds of messages they're saying. Scientists are crying, begging in front of banks, on the street to stop donating money to fossil fuel mining. They're saying future generations will have to fight for water. We only have 3 years to do something before climate change is irreversible. I'm hopeless. And the reality is that some of these statements are a bit misinformed, but the point is that it's generating this anxiety and this just really kind of making people scared, and hopelessness among the youth is something that we really need to be worried about. On the other hand, this kind of anxiety could also trigger action. So it's not only going to make people inactive. But when she posted this, she got a lot of pushback. And people were saying, rethink your conclusion. Place blame on the strategy of shielding young people from the whole picture, not on Scientist Rebellion for lifting the curtain. And I think this part of this process is showing sort of how we are within the climate change community. We're actually not taking full account of the way that our messages, the way that our actions can be interpreted by people who don't have the full picture, but also who don't really sort of who are in a position of maybe vulnerability, in the sense of emotional vulnerability and otherwise. So then we have to ask questions about sort of the role of this narrative of doomism, which isn't necessarily always coming from that statement that will pass 1.5, but is doomism in itself as a narrative a form of activism, or is it a form of denialism, or does doomism mean extinction? And for me, as a development studies person, I always come back to, asking, what about the development context? If we extract climate change, we still see a very uneven world with huge inequalities and many of the similar problems, maybe on a slightly smaller scale. And so we have to ask, what role does that play? And in fact, this is where we need to pause for a second, because we need to ask about whose knowledge is being drawn on to develop this narrative, because climate change remains something seen primarily as a technical problem, and therefore the solutions are also seen as technical often. And the social sciences and the humanities all still continue to be marginalized, even though there's a lot more from us to contribute now. We have a huge amount more that we can offer. But in particular, I think the notion of justice, and therefore climate justice, is present also in this knowledge production process. And I should probably be more specific and say it's the injustice that's present in the knowledge production process. And so Vaishnavi talks about how, in fact, this narrative of emergency is actually being weaponized, and it's particularly you can see the difference between a narrative that's driven by the global north versus this sort of the implications for the global south. And in fact, there isn't really much emphasis on the global south perspective on emergency. And so she highlights how actually what this kind of talking about emergency, it puts us into a kind of quasi-permanent state of emergency, because we declare the emergency and then it continues and it continues and continues. But also how this, to some extent, what happens is that it marginalizes the voices of the marginalized communities. It doesn't actually allow for them to come forward, because it's a way to say, oh, this is an emergency. But whose emergency are we talking about? And I think this is really critical. And to some extent, it also puts in question the kind of, what I often, to be honest, personally tend to create this connection between climate justice and social justice. But if climate justice is not seen as something that looks deeply enough into the actual drivers of vulnerability and inequality and so on, then I'm not sure if it's actually fair to say that climate justice is the same as social justice. I mean, I think we could probably say social justice may be the bigger one, and then climate justice falls within it. But I do think that we need to be really careful when we tread and we make these analogies, because what's happening is essentially, that we're seeing people aligning themselves with different narratives, and there are different kinds of people who are aligning themselves with these different narratives. Also, the emergency frame links with this natural disasters idea that the disasters are caused somehow outside of the human creation, and that actually humans have nothing to do with the disaster. I mean, I think we recognize that that's not true, but the way that we use this concept of natural disaster is hugely misleading in that sense. So it shifts the responsibility away from the people in power or whoever, and it shifts it more onto nature. So then I come back to this question, like what role is played by beliefs in these narratives, and how can we move ahead here? Just to recall again, I think that this piece is so good that Ali has written this, but she talks about how the call for declaring climate emergency is antithetical to the concept of climate justice, and formulating action around the idea of emergency needs to be reflected on more critically. Because these narratives often fail to question what an emergency means on an everyday basis, and how do emergencies pan out in the global north and the south? How are emergencies of people with socially and economically secured lives different from the emergencies of the marginalized, oppressed, and disadvantaged? So now to shift into this final part of the talk, I just want to highlight this concept of discourse of climate delay that I mentioned in the beginning. So Lam et al. Wrote this paper. It was published in 2020, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I highly recommend it. The reference is at the bottom, but I'm sure you can find it online. It identifies essentially 12 discourses of climate delay, but within, so kind of 4 categories, and within these, there are 2 to 4, there are 2 with 3 and 1 with 4 and 1 with 2. And I think that this is probably a starting point for thinking about kind of the role that our beliefs play in then having these knock-on effects that lead to either inaction or action. And they identify that the idea of redirecting responsibility, that someone else should take action first, or the push for non-transformative solutions, the sort of not really transformative solutions under the concept that disruptive change is not necessary. That there's also the discourse that emphasizes the downsides, that change would be too disruptive. And also this, as I'm talking about, the doomism, the surrender, it's not possible to mitigate climate change, let's just give up. And within this, yes, you'll find the doomism, and you'll find that this sort of notion that change is impossible. But I think, and it's very nicely illustrated here in this much more fun graph, but it's impossible to read probably for you, so I'm just pointing it out because I think it's been picked up by a lot of people, including this artist. But if we look at it again, I think, here clearly, if we were to then kind of bring this into much more looking at kind of the way that political beliefs or religious belief actually influence these kinds of perspectives, I think we'd find something really interesting. And this is where I said, I don't have all the answers. I haven't done this analysis yet, but I just want to highlight an example, because I think that in that discourses of climate delay don't necessarily feature adaptation very much. It's really around kind of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But if you were to look at adaptation, there are 2 really interesting perspectives. What's coming out a lot now I'm seeing is this sort of adaptationism. And adaptationism is very kind of positive about adaptation working, that there are no limits to adaptation. And just maybe I should be clear that in the recent IPCC report, it was very, very clear that there are lots of limits to adaptation, both in natural systems and in human systems. But under this narrative, when adaptation works, we don't need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because essentially we can just keep adapting until, whatever, 5 degrees. And it was interesting. I think the first time I came across this narrative was in 2002. And there was a side event at one of the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention, where they were talking about adapt now. And I was very excited because I was still working on my PhD at that time on adaptation, and there weren't that many others working on adaptation. I thought, wow, look at this, adaptation is really, if people are talking about it. And then I went to see more about the event, and it turns out it was all funded by fossil fuel industry, who were basically trying to redirect the conversation toward the idea of adapting and say, let's not worry about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, let us keep emitting and, making profits. So there is this undercurrent of anti-mitigation. But there's another narrative around adaptation that is also very much sort of, I would say, adaptationist, but not quite, but coming from a different perspective. And this is called deep adaptation. And this is where it's too late to reverse the climate crisis. That's kind of the narrative. And it's a more recent narrative as well. And it talks about that societal collapse is actually inevitable. And so instead, what this is about is confronting and sharing your pain and grief and confusion with each other. They talk about how building new ideas from this rubble, look at what kind of value is emerging, and focus on building strong and enduring communities. So it's a different kind of understanding of adaptation, and it's somewhat different understanding of different understanding of the problem. But I think it's relevant because it is to some extent another form of this sort of climate delay, a discourse of climate delay. So let me then kind of come to an end on this, which I've been working on for a while, and I feel a little bit, well, I hope that it makes some sense to you. But the idea here is really to try to understand, where does action lie and where does belief lie? And so I have tried to juxtapose the idea of beliefs and explanation spaces. And explanation spaces for me is sort of where we have a way to understand climate change. So essentially, there is an empty adaptation space where there is no pre-existing explanation for what's happening in terms of climate change that has been provided by traditions, religion, or other sorts of sources that shape beliefs. So here, this kind of, it might be potentially a space where a kind of climate pro climate action could have a better be absorbed more. Then in a flexible explanation space, you might have where beliefs, there is a kind of existing belief or explanation for what's going on based in kind of traditional knowledge or sort of other kinds of forms of knowledge, but it can evolve and shift given certain conditions. And this is the big question, is what are these conditions? And presumably they're going to be quite specific depending on who you're talking about. But here I would expect that you would still be able to integrate somehow this beliefs about climate change, beliefs with understanding of climate change, and that it wouldn't necessarily contradict. And then the final perspective is this rigid explanation space, where you have this space is already occupied by a belief that has been passed on by traditions, maybe religion or politics or other sources. And it's so firmly held that it may not be influenced by other beliefs, and nothing will replace it. And this is maybe where we get kind of this potentially, depending on what kind of information comes out about climate change, it gets stuck in that box and it doesn't actually have any influence. So what I'm trying to do is sort of say, how can we unpack these different kind of models of understanding the world and the role that beliefs play in against these different narratives and discourses on climate change. And I think that the following this narrative of emergency and urgency offers us an insight into the way that different understandings, different perspectives, different explanations and approaches to communication lead to different kinds of outcomes. And I think maybe just to close, I think one of the main reasons why we continuously seem to have problems getting climate action moving is because that social sciences and humanities have to date not been given sufficient space to help explain human behavior, to help explain sort of the policy inertia. And I think this is part of the reason why we're now stuck in this situation where we're really need to transform, but we have these narratives that are fighting against that transformation so badly that I don't really honestly see how we're going to break through that. So on that somewhat maybe not super optimistic note, I'm going to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that input. May I hand it over to Julia.
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side, Lisa. That was really fascinating. And we're going to move now to Ashish Kotari's talk. And as Joram said at the beginning, we will leave the questions for the end, but feel free to type them already in the chat if you already have them. So Ashish Kotari is an Indian environmentalist working on development, environment, interface, biodiversity policy, and alternatives. And he's one of the founders of Kalpabrish, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it well, he can correct me, which is a non-profit organization in India dealing with environmental and developmental issues. And he has been associated with people's movements, and he has also been a teacher of environment at the Indian Institute of Public Administration in New Delhi. And he has also been a guest faculty at several universities and institutes and Mellon Fellow at Bowdoin College at the USA. And Ashish has served on the Indian government's Environmental Appraisal Committee on River Valley projects and expert committees to formulate India's Biological Diversity Act and National Wildlife Action Plan. He coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process and was co-coordinator of the activist academic co-generation of knowledge on environmental justice global project. He's the author or editor of over 30 books, including Churning the Earth, Making of Global India, published by Penguin in 2014, and Pluriverse, a post-developmental dictionary published by Columbia University Press in 2019. And his talk is entitled, and again, sorry for the pronunciation, Eco Swaraj, Rebuilding Peace with the Earth and Each Other. And I'm very happy that we can have Ashish Kotari with us. I listened to him, I think it was at the ISA online World Conference a couple of years ago, and it's an honor to have you here with us today. So the floor is yours, Ashish. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Julia and Jaram and everybody else for organizing this and giving this opportunity. And thanks, Lisa, for your words. I will try and also build on this. So I think you've laid a very good foundation for some of what I'm going to say. Yeah, okay, so let me, well, firstly, I think just like Lisa, a little bit of a qualification here. I am not an expert on religion or on climate change, actually. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to look at the intersectionality between what is happening with ecological collapse, including climate, the political and economic aspects related to that, and of course the cultural and spiritual aspects or parts of our life which are related to that, and focus much more actually on less on the bad news, which we're hearing all the time, of course, and it's important to focus on that, but focus much more on what people are doing on the ground in terms of responses to these crises, and the kinds of sort of broad worldviews and frameworks that are emerging from these grounded initiatives. So I'd like to dwell much more on that. Let me see if you can tell me whether you're seeing the presentation full screen.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, well, the term is eco-Swaraj. Okay, thanks. The term is eco-Swaraj. I will explain that a bit later in the presentation, but essentially the focus is trying to see what are the sorts of pathways that are already emerging out of the global crises. And even as we do go through collapse, and I agree there with what Lisa was talking about, I don't think we can delay, I don't think we can stop all of the collapses. Some are already happening actually for the global south. But what's emerging out of the collapses? What are the sorts of saplings and seeds that we need to nurture in order to find those pathways out of the crises and the collapses? Now we know that in terms of the bad news, the notion of development, especially as it is focused on the religion of economic growth, and I don't think it's anything less than a religion, has meant, of course, that there have been benefits for a lot of people, but it has also meant incredible amounts of violence for the rest of nature, like you see in this particular advertisement. And of course, for communities, all of us, but especially those communities most directly dependent on nature and natural resources for their livelihoods, their daily survival, their cultural survival, and so on. And I'm thinking of this process over the last especially the last 100, 200 years, as the destruction of livelihoods, which were not jobs. The word livelihoods includes life in them. These were occupations that were built within cultural ecological contexts, to what we now have in the modern sector, which is mostly jobs where the work is separated from leisure, where for the 90% of the work population, especially for instance in industries like the IT sector, these are extremely mechanical, very non-creative, and very soul-deadening jobs. And I call this a movement from livelihoods to deadlihoods. We've also seen in the last 2 years, it's basically these 2 years have exposed how many hundreds of millions of people are in extremely vulnerable positions, especially those who have very, very insecure livelihoods or jobs. We've seen how private corporations have used this as an opportunity for significantly becoming richer, and many governments to actually increase their centralized authoritarian power. But we've also seen the converse, which is incredible examples of human solidarity, of people reaching out to each other, of young people who helping older people, of the rich helping the poor, to be able to cope with the kind of multiple crises that we saw in the last couple of years. And that's the part I'd like to focus on much more, because the biggest question that has arisen for us, for humanity, of course, is, do we have to continue along this extremely disastrous pathway of so-called development, or do we have alternatives? Do we have to accept what Margaret Thatcher said famously a few decades back, that there is no alternative, or no, in fact, that there are alternatives? And I think that there are, and I think I'd like to say that there are two kinds of alternatives, very broadly, generally speaking. One is resistance. People across the world saying, sorry, we don't accept this system anymore. We won't accept it, not just in terms of the symptoms of the problem, which is to say, let's say, climate crisis and ecological collapse and inequality and so on, but even the fundamental structures that are creating these in the first place. the various isms, whether it's statism or capitalism or racism or patriarchy or anthropocentrism, that we want to challenge these at their very roots in order to actually get to the solutions. And if you look at these movements, for instance, this one is from 30 years back in central India, where indigenous people fought against 2 mega hydroelectricity projects. And in their articulation, they were not only saying that we don't want our villages to be submerged and displaced, but that this river is our mother, and we will not allow our mother to be shackled by your dreams of progress. So you see in these resistance movements different ways of articulating our relationship with each other and with the rest of nature. Worldviews, and you can call them religions, faiths, worldviews, concepts, etc. You see these in the anti-racism movements right now, in the peace movements in Myanmar and other places, the climate justice movements, which Lisa also mentioned, the famous farmers movement in India, which ran for a whole year, and many others, the Chile new constitution, etc., etc. These show us that there are different ways of looking at things than what the modern system, the modern economic system, capitalist statist system is telling us. And this is really, really important, because when Lisa mentioned technocratic ways of looking at things, or techno fixes, this is what the system, currently dominant system, is telling us, that, oh, we also have the solutions. We'll do carbon, net zero carbon, this thing, we'll do carbon trading, we'll do XYZ, even sustainable development. If you look at the way it's framed, the 2015 SDGs, for instance, actually say we'll do gender justice and we'll do climate sustainability, ecological sustainability, etc. But then one of the goals is also economic growth, as if, you can continue to have economic growth on a finite planet. So there are internal contradictions which cannot be resolved within the current system. One has to be able to challenge that. And that's what the second kind of alternative movements are also doing. We have some incredible examples all over the world of people constructing or reconstructing their lives to meet basic human needs and aspirations, and to live lives that are happier, more wealthy, wealth as in well-being, not wealth as in money. There are thousands and thousands of them. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into many, but I'm going to give a glimpse of a few of these, just to remind ourselves that there are these grounded, incredible initiatives that we need to focus on much more and learn from. This one is from southern India. This is 5,000 Dalit women farmers. Dalit is the most oppressed section of Indian society, the so-called untouchables or outcasts. As women, they're also oppressed in a patriarchal society. Over the last 30 years, these families who used to face hunger, malnutrition, lack of access to education, health, etc., have revolutionized their lives through actually coming back into biologically diverse, locally sustainable, very low input agriculture, moving towards not just full food security, but food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food, including the knowledge. And they're reasserting their connection with seeds and the earth as not just economic resources, but as spiritual parts of life, the earth as a spiritual being, not just as an economic resource. And in the COVID pandemic, amazingly, the same women who were going hungry 30 years back today are able to contribute to the food relief measures of the local administration. All the way across the earth, in the Peruvian highlands of the Andes, the Quechua indigenous community, a fairly similar story of claiming full control over their biocultural territory, moving towards food sovereignty, local direct democracy, etc., and contributing again to food relief measures in the COVID pandemic period. We go to, say, Central Western Asia, where in the midst of one of the most war-torn areas of the earth, the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey border, you have the Kurdish ethnic community trying to create a large region of peace, of local democracy, of living with and working with the earth and with the ecosystems through what they call genealogy, or their own ecofeminist principles. Even in Europe, in the midst of the most capitalist societies on the planet, initiatives at non-capitalist economies. For instance, this factory in Greece run democratically by workers who have this big slogan on the factory saying, "We have no boss." All the workers are part of decision-making in the factory. And every worker, whatever he or she is doing, gets exactly the same wage for 1 hour of work. Now think how revolutionary that is, right? Or time banking, where people actually share their time free of resources, which has traditionally always been the case for thousands of years. But with the increasing capitalism of the society, everything is now measured in money terms. So how do you actually bring back that I can share my expertise in yoga or physics or whatever, free of cost for say 5 hours a week to anybody in the community who needs it. And in turn, I will get something else from somebody else. How do we bring that kind of spirit back into our economic relations? And many others. I won't go into too much detail here. Over the last 2 years, we've been documenting stories of resilience to the COVID pandemic, not just health, but the economic crisis that the pandemic created, or rather what nation states created in their response to the pandemic. So we have about 75, 80 stories from all over India of young people, of women, of farmers, of different kinds of people kind of becoming or asserting and showing how they can be resilient in terms of food, livelihoods, health, etc. Okay, so I was just saying that based on an understanding of what's emerging from a lot of these grounded initiatives, what we see is a kind of a sort of the possibilities of holistic transformation towards very fundamental changes in the structure of society itself, which enables us to be able to deal with the climate and other crises in a much more strong manner. I'm not going to go into all of these, the 5 petals that you see in this flower, which is really the political, economic, social, cultural, and ecological spheres. But I'll give a glimpse of some of the kinds of transformations already taking place and what more needs to happen. So if you look at, for instance, the articulation of some of these movements, they're saying that we need to be at the center of decision making. We don't leave it to politicians and bureaucrats. Democracy is about power of the people, not power of politicians that we elect. And in that sense, it's a very direct challenge to the neoliberal form of democracy, where we think that democracy is about going to the elections and then voting a party into power and then hoping desperately that that party will do the right thing for us, which we know doesn't necessarily work, right? So in central India, for instance, a slogan that many villages have come up with in asserting this is that we elect the government in New Delhi and we will make it accountable, but in our village, we are the government. All decisions will get taken by us through consensus in our own system. And that also actually enables us to question a lot of our current political boundaries, because if you look at a lot of nation state boundaries, especially those where colonialism, which have had colonialism as a past, you find that they're cutting across ecologically contiguous or flows, ecological flows like rivers or mountain chains. They're also cutting across cultural linkages, nomadic territories, cultural linkages of various kinds. And so you actually start looking at the possibility of questioning even the political boundaries from a biological, ecological, and cultural perspective, and rethinking political boundaries themselves. But this also means a transformation towards the localization of the economy, to actually bring the economy back in the hands of workers, producers, actually those who are putting in all the sweat and toil, and not capitalists or the state. And which also then means it's, as I said earlier, it's an economy of caring and sharing, not everything based on just monetary transactions. This also then means that unlike all countries of the world except Bhutan, which think of development in the form of GDP growth rates, we have to start looking at very alternative, different kinds of indicators of what it means to be progressing or advancing or developing, which are things like, does everybody have clean drinking water? Does everybody have adequate nutritious food? Does everybody have a good living conditions? Does everybody have a voice in decision making? Does everybody have good access to learning and health opportunities, etc.? All of which GDP actually never captures. GDP is a completely nonsensical indicator for real well-being, so to speak. Now, of course, all of this also has to go hand in hand with struggles for social justice, because we know that there are, both in traditional societies and in modern society, there are inequalities of all kinds: gender, sexuality, in India, casteism, racism in so many parts of the world, etc. Since this particular session is also really looking at religion and worldviews, these transformations are also about very fundamental transformations in the way we look at culture and knowledge. We've had cultural homogenization for 500 years through Western colonialism, and it continues in many ways. So the struggles for reasserting a diversity of languages, a diversity of cuisines, a diversity of knowledge systems, not just modern science and technology, but multiple different knowledge systems, in response to the current crises is very important. It also means decolonizing the mind. If you will remember the map that I put up earlier on, where Africa is on top and Europe at the bottom, it's a map that a lot of people ask me saying, why is it upside down? And I say, well, there's nothing upside down. If you look at the Earth from space, it depends on what angle you're looking at it from, right? And actually the maps we think of as normal right side up are the ones that came up in colonial times, where Europe was put on top and Europe was made to look much bigger than it actually is. So decolonizing ourselves in so many different ways, right? Even knowledge and science and technology, why do we think that it is the domain of only the so-called expert institutions or of corporations? It is the domain of everyday persons. Most technological innovations in human history have actually taken place by people who are so-called ordinary. I mean, does any of us know who invented the wheel? And would we have any progress without the wheel? Etc. I mean, that's just one example that I can give you many more. So how do we again democratize science and technology and innovations and knowledge? Which also then means actually fundamentally challenging our education system. In India, our education system is designed to create people who will fit into the current system, either in corporations or in the government. How do we actually create learning spaces where the real creativity, the questioning mind, the curiosity of the child is actually encouraged, and where learning is not just about what happens in the mind, but it's also about what do we do with our feet, with our hands, with our heart. So it's a combination. Gandhiji spoke about what he called the Nai Talim, or the new way of learning, which is combining the heart, hands, and head, and not just the head. It's about recommoning media and the arts. If you look at what's happening to the privatization of the media space, or the privatization even of arts, it's completely antithetical to the kinds of values we're talking about. And of course, then beyond the dogmatic assertions of our religions, which are unfortunately also creating enormous conflicts, sort of reimagining religion itself in terms of the fundamental roots, the fundamental spiritual roots of religions, which is really about values, which is what I'm going to get into in a minute. Equally important part of this transformation is re-examining our relationship with the rest of the earth. Modern Western civilization has told us humans and nature. It's this pyramid of life, right? The left-hand side image here, which I learned in biology in my school, which gives us a hierarchical way of looking at life. In fact, if you see there, the man is above the woman, which is very much part of that system. Whereas indigenous peoples have always said, we are one out of thousands of species. We're a circle of life. And that means building the humility to be respectful of the rest of nature, which we are a part of. So not just human rights, but also the rights of the rest of nature. And the commonality of spirit with the rest of the earth, which we have to then bring back into our lives. And the most crucial part of this flower of transformation, so to speak, is ethics and principles. And I'm not going to go into these in any kind of detail. We don't have the time. But for instance, fourth bullet point here, all of these examples of transformation are where people have gone beyond competition to look at cooperation, beyond the privatization of life to the commons, expressing human solidarity and generosity and mutual aid, right? Where they're saying that happiness is not just about buying more and more and more and more and more, and so-called, what is that term? Retail therapy, but actually it's about better social relationships. Of course, having basic needs met, but also good opportunities for learning, for being with the rest of nature, etc. So, and also never to forget that enjoying ourselves is an equally important part of a value for ourselves. We have to, like I think somebody said, I don't want to be part of the revolution unless there's dancing and music in it. And so essentially we're talking about the fact that these are worldviews that celebrate life, not money, not fame, not power, but life. And that creates a very fundamentally different way of looking at things. Here in India, one of the sort of worldviews that has emerged from these grounded initiatives is what we call eco-Swaraj. The word Swaraj means self-rule, which is to say autonomy or independence, but autonomy with responsibility towards your autonomy, your independence, your well-being, your happiness, right? So it's not the American way of thinking of freedom where I can run my SUV wherever I want and I can bomb a country if it doesn't give me petrol for cheap rates. It's really saying yes, I will be independent, my community will be independent, we will assert our way of doing things, but not at the cost of your way of doing things. And that's really about rights and responsibilities. And in that sense, what it does is to put the community, the collective, especially the grounded collective, at the center of decision making, not the nation state, not the private corporation. There are similar notions from all over the earth, ancient worldviews from indigenous peoples, which are being reasserted in modern movements of struggles of various kinds, radical reinterpretations of religions that I mentioned, but also worldviews emerging from the belly of the beast, so to speak, from very capitalist or statist societies, such as degrowth in Europe, ecofeminism in many parts of the world, etc. And what I think is very important is that these are all very, very diverse. It's a pluriverse. That's why we call it a pluriverse and not a universe. But they're connected through common values, through common ethics, through common principles. And so when we're trying to emerge from these crises, whether it's COVID or it's any of the other climate crises, etc., we're not just talking about being green or being red. The Green New Deals, which are very popular now in Europe and the United States, is to say that, no, we need revolutions of multiple colors, multiple hues. It's a rainbow New Deals that we need, which will look very different in different parts of the earth, but based on these common principles and ethics. And a lot of people ask me this question, okay, you got this wonderful example in Rojava, you got this wonderful example of Dalit women in India and of Quechua indigenous people in Peru, but how do we upscale these? How do we make sure that they're actually making the macro impact that needs to be made? And my response is that it's not about upscaling. Upscaling is a very corporate way of looking at things, that something is successful, you make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Nor is it about replication. You cannot exactly copy a solution from one place to another because every place is different. But it's outscaling, which is to say we learn the lessons from different initiatives, and we then look at those lessons, those values, those principles, those processes, and then apply it in our own context. And then network amongst these initiatives, thousands and thousands of grounded initiatives, networking to become that larger scale. That's happening with agroecology, it's happening with gender movements, it's happening with many things like that. And so you don't have a hierarchy, you actually have horizontal weaving that takes place, which would hopefully create those macro shifts. So last minute I'll take is to just tell you about a couple of processes which are trying to do this more and more. One is in India, where since 2014, we have a horizontal platform called the Vikalp Sangam, or the Alternatives Confluences, where hundreds of organizations and individuals from different parts of India coming together, learning, collaborating, collectively visioning what a better India could look like, and then becoming more of a macro, more of a sort of a critical mass for the macro shifts. And then learning from that and similar processes in other parts of the world, like Crianza Mutua in Colombia and Mexico, trying to create a global tapestry of alternatives, again, horizontally weaving them together rather than creating a hierarchical single organization. All of this is much more available, of course, on the websites that I will show you at the end. And I'll put them in the chat also for anybody interested in looking at more of this and also connecting with us for these kinds of transformations. Two books that I will mention in the chat, I'll put the links there. You can download these for free. PDF, Pluriverse, the book that you mentioned, Julia, this is available now in 4 languages, English, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. We're going to get another 4 or 5 languages soon. Has 100 essays of radical alternatives from different parts of the earth. And then the Alternative Futures book is actually what India could be in 2100, sort of a dream vision in multiple different sectors. And then coming back to the present and saying, what pathways do we have to get there? What are the hurdles? What are the opportunities, etc. And I'm going to leave you with these websites and my email ID for any further interaction. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the glitch in the middle, and I hope to be able to take part in the discussion now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ashish. That was wonderful. And despite a few moments of technical problems, we could really get your message. And indeed, as you said, a bit of an optimistic message to balance also the negative messages that we hear.